Not all hospitality is born of kindness. Sometimes it arises from necessity, sometimes from fear, and sometimes from something much darker that lurks in the shadows of the human soul. Jack Miller held the reins with calloused hands as he watched the isolated farm loom over the horizon like a mirage in the Arizona desert. The sun began its slow descent behind the distant mountains, painting the sky blood red. He had not seen another human being for 3 days, 3 days riding through the dry, cracked earth, guided only by the distant smoke rising from a lonely chimney. Thirst burned his throat like red-hot iron. Her lips were parted, the skin on her face battered by the relentless sun. The horse beneath him breathed heavily, each step a struggle against the fatigue that consumed them. There was no choice. They needed water, rest. A place to spend the night before complete darkness made the journey even more dangerous. The house was bigger than he expected. 2 high waters, wood darkened by time and wind, windows that reflected the reddish sky like watchful eyes. A wooden fence surrounded a small pasture where a few cattle rested in the scanty shade of a lone tree. Everything seemed normal, calm even, but there was something in the air that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. He slowly dismounted, each muscle protesting the movement. The silence around was almost absolute, broken only by the dry wind that made the planks of the house creak like old bones. He tied the reins to the fence post and walked toward the porch, his footsteps echoing on the dirt floor. It was then that he saw them. 2 women came out of the house, one after the other, as if they had been watching his approach through the dark windows. They were tall, extraordinarily tall, with broad shoulders that completely filled the doorframes. Their simple cotton dresses could not disguise the imposing structure of their bodies, and their faces, although feminine, carried a hardness that only life in the desert can sculpt. The eldest took a step forward. His grey hair was tied back into a tight bun, and his small, dark eyes examined Jack from head to toe with the precision of someone sizing cattle at the market. The youngest remained half hidden behind her sister, but Jack could feel her intense gaze on him, as if he was memorizing every detail of her appearance. The afternoon was beginning to get colder, but sweat was still running down Jack's back. There was something about that place, in those 2 women, that aroused a primal instinct of danger. But his thirst was greater than his fear, and darkness was fast approaching. He took off his hat and held it with both hands, a gesture of respect that he learned was necessary when one needed the kindness of strangers. The 2 women continued silently, studying it as predators study wounded prey. The wind blew harder, causing the loose planks of the porch to hit against the structure of the house. In the distance, a coyote howled, a long, melancholy sound that echoed through the deserted valley. Jack swallowed, preparing to speak, to ask for the hospitality he so desperately needed. But before she could utter a word, the older woman opened a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said the words that would change the course of that night in ways Jack could never have imagined. The words came out of the older woman's mouth as a statement, not an invitation. "You will sleep in our room tonight." There was no question in her voice. There was no room for refusal. It was a simple, straightforward statement that cut through the afternoon air like the blade of a razor-sharp knife. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine, but thirst and fatigue spoke louder than the instinct of danger. He nodded, thanking her for the hospitality, even as every fiber of his being screamed at him to get on the horse and leave that place. Darkness was already beginning to engulf the distant mountains, and to travel at night in that territory would be to ask to die. The younger woman finally came out completely from behind her sister. She was even taller, if that was possible, with long arms and hands that seemed capable of breaking thick branches effortlessly. Her eyes were a faded blue, like the desert sky at noon, and she watched Jack with a curiosity that bordered on fascination. There was something childish about his gaze, an innocence that contrasted strangely with his imposing appearance. The older sister made a brusque gesture with her hand, indicating that Jack should go inside the house. The interior was dark and stuffy, with the smell of old wood and something else he couldn't identify. The ceiling beams were too low for the two women, who had to bow their heads slightly as they walked. Jack, even though he was a man of average height, felt small in that environment dominated by his hostesses. The main room was Spartan. A solid wood table occupied the center, surrounded by chairs that seemed to have been built especially to accommodate large people. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with still hot embers glowing like red eyes in the dim light. Some iron pots hung from hooks, and the smell of stew hung in the air. The older woman pointed to one of the chairs. Jack sat up, feeling the wood groan under his weight, even though it was much lighter than the two women. The younger sister disappeared towards what seemed to be the kitchen, and soon he heard the sound of dishes being handled and liquid being spilled. She returned carrying a clay mug filled with water. Jack accepted her with genuine gratitude, sipping long sips that soothed the burning in his throat. The water was fresh and clean, probably coming from an artesian well. He emptied the mug completely and returned it with a nod of thanks. The older woman had sat in the opposite chair, her huge hands clasped across the table. She studied Jack with the same intensity as before, as if she were trying to decipher some mystery written on his face. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the embers in the fireplace and the wind that whistled through the cracks of the house. It was then that Jack noticed the details he had missed in his haste to find shelter. The chairs were really too big for normal people. The doors were wider than usual. Even the dishes piled up on a nearby shelf were oversized. Everything in that house had been built or adapted to accommodate people of extraordinary stature. Even more disturbing were the small objects scattered around the house. Boots of different sizes lined up near the door, some too small to belong to the two sisters. A men's hat hangs from a hook with a ribbon faded by the sun. A silver belt buckle over the fireplace, polished to a mirror glow. Jack tried not to show his growing discomfort, but his hand instinctively moved toward the colt strapped to his waist. The older woman followed the movement with her eyes, and her smile widened, revealing large teeth yellowed by time. The younger sister returned from the kitchen carrying a steaming bowl of stew. The aroma was rich and tempting, but Jack hesitated before accepting. There were stories that circulated through the camps and frontier towns, stories about travelers who disappeared into the vastness of the desert, about isolated farms where terrible things happened away from the eyes of the law. But hunger was a cruel companion, and the stew smelled too good to refuse. Jack accepted the bowl and began to eat slowly, savoring each spoonful while keeping his senses alert for any sign of danger. Outside, night had completely fallen, bringing with it the biting cold of the desert. The distant howl of coyotes echoed through the darkness, a constant reminder that here, far from civilization, the normal rules of society did not apply. The two sisters continued to watch him eat, his eyes shining like those of felines in the dim light of the fireplace. Jack knew he had crossed a threshold by accepting their hospitality, but now it was too late to turn back. The only way out was forward, through the night that promised to be long and full of revelations that he might prefer not to discover. The meal ended in absolute silence. Jack placed the empty bowl on the table and watched the two sisters exchange meaningful glances, as if they were communicating through a language that only they knew. The younger woman began to collect the utensils with deliberate movements, while the older woman remained seated, her small, dark eyes never failing to follow Jack's every gesture. The cold of the desert night began to seep through the cracks in the wooden house, making the flames of the fireplace dance uneasily. Jack could hear his horse neighing softly outside, a familiar sound that reassured him in the midst of this atmosphere charged with unspoken tension. The older woman finally stood up, her impressive height making her need to bow her head so as not to touch the ceiling beams. She walked over to a heavy dark wood dresser and opened one of the drawers, pulling out something that made Jack's blood run cold in her veins. It was a time-worn leather wallet, the kind men carried in their vest inside pocket. She opened her wallet with almost reverent care and began to examine its contents. Jack could see yellowed papers, some silver coins, and what appeared to be a small portrait. The woman studied each item with the attention of someone who had done that ritual many times before. The younger sister finished cleaning the table and came over to observe the objects. His faded blue eyes shone with suppressed excitement, as if he were watching precious treasures being displayed. She mumbled something in a low voice to her sister, words that Jack couldn't fully pick up, but which sounded like approval or satisfaction. Jack knew he had to do something. His survival instinct, honed by years of riding through the most dangerous territories of the West, screamed that he was in mortal danger. But his muscles seemed to have lost their strength. His legs were heavy as lead, and a strange drowsiness began to take over his mind. The stew. There was something in the stew. He tried to get up from his chair, but his body did not obey his brain's commands. Reality began to blur around the edges, as if looking through dirty water. The voices of the two women came to him distorted, like echoes from a deep well. The older woman put her wallet back in the drawer and approached Jack with measured steps. His lips moved, but the words seemed to reach him with a delay, as if the sound had to travel a great distance before reaching his ears. She was talking about other travelers, other men who had stopped at that farm in search of hospitality. Jack fought the darkness that threatened to engulf his consciousness. Through the fog that clouded his vision, he could see his younger sister heading for what appeared to be a large chest in the corner of the room. She opened it with difficulty, and more personal belongings came out of it. Pocket watches, rings, knives with ornate handles, silver spurs, trophies, memories. Proof of how many men had passed through there and never left. With superhuman effort, Jack managed to move his hand toward the Colt at his waist. His fingers touched the handle of the weapon, but they no longer had the strength to wield it. The drug-induced artificial drowsiness in the stew was overcoming his resistance, pushing him inexorably toward unconsciousness. The two women continued their activities as if Jack was no longer there. The youngest had begun to separate objects into small mounds on the floor, arranging them by type or value. The eldest watched with satisfaction, occasionally picking up an item to examine more closely. It was then that Jack heard something that made his heart race, even through the fog of drugs that clouded his senses. Steps, heavy footsteps, coming from somewhere inside the house. It was not the footsteps of the two sisters, which he had already learned to recognize. They were different, heavier, more deliberate. Someone else was in that house. Through the mist that covered his vision, Jack saw a door open at the back of the room, a door he hadn't noticed before. A figure emerged from the darkness beyond the threshold, a silhouette that made even the two giant women look small in comparison. The figure slowly approached, his footsteps making the wooden floor groan under the weight. Jack tried to focus his eyes, tried to see clearly who or what was approaching, but the drug in his system made it all a series of blurry images and dancing shadows. The voice that emerged from the figure was deep as the distant roar of thunder, charged with an authority that did not admit of questioning. The two sisters bowed slightly as the figure spoke, displaying a deference that clearly revealed who was really running this sinister operation. Jack knew he was losing the battle against unconsciousness. His eyelids weighed tons, and the world around him began to disappear into a black hole of silence. The last thing he managed to register before he completely succumbed was the sound of chains being dragged across the floor, and a low, ominous laugh that echoed through the house as the harbinger of nightmares yet to come. The darkness swallowed him completely, but even unconsciously, a part of his mind kept struggling, planning, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. Consciousness returned to Jack like a slow, painful wave. First came the headache, a constant pulse that hammered against his skull as if someone were hitting it with a hammer from the inside. Then came the nausea, making her stomach turn violently. Finally, came the terrifying realization that his hands and feet were bound with thick ropes. He was lying on a bed that creaked with every movement, in a small, stuffy room, lit only by a lone candle that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The smell of mold and moisture permeated the air, mixed with something more disturbing that he preferred not to identify. Through a small, dirty window, she could see that it was still night, but she didn't know how long she had been unconscious. Jack tried to move his arms, testing the strength of the ropes that bound him. They were tightly tied together, but not impossible to loosen with time and patience. His captors had made the mistake of underestimating his experience in desperate situations. Through years of riding through the most dangerous territories, he had learned some valuable lessons about survival. The sounds of the house came to him in a muffled way through the thin walls. He could hear the voices of the two sisters talking in low tones, occasionally interrupted by the deep voice of that third figure that had appeared before he passed out. They seemed to be discussing something, their voices rising and falling at a pace that suggested disagreement or careful planning. With slow, deliberate movements, Jack began to work on the ropes that bound his wrists. The rope was rough and tore at his skin with every movement, but he ignored the pain. There were worse things than superficial wounds waiting for him if he couldn't break free. As he worked, his eyes adapted better to the dim light of the candle, and he was able to examine the room in more detail. The walls were covered with personal objects from different eras and styles. Hats hung from rusty nails, leather vests arranged on hooks, belts with ornate buckles hanging like macabre trophies. At a small desk in the corner of the room, Jack could see his own gun, wallet and other personal belongings already organized as if they were part of a collection. Next to them, a stack of papers that appeared to be letters or personal documents from other victims. The sight made his blood boil with anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. Uncontrolled anger would be his undoing. The voices outside grew louder for a moment, and Jack could pick up fragments of the conversation. They were discussing what to do with him, when would be the best time, what the method would be. The words came to him distorted, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. Jack stepped up his efforts with the ropes. One of the turns began to loosen slightly, creating a small space that he explored carefully. If I could let go of one hand, the rest would be easier. The rope cut through his raw skin, leaving red marks that burned like hot iron, but he couldn't afford to stop. Suddenly, the sounds of the house changed. The mysterious figure's heavy footsteps began to move toward the room where Jack was imprisoned. Each step made the floorboards groan under the weight, creating a terrifying countdown to his arrival. Jack stopped moving and pretended to still be unconscious, keeping his eyes closed and breathing deeply and regularly. The ropes on his wrists were looser, but still not loose enough that he could quickly break free. He needed more time, but time was a luxury that was running out quickly. The door to the room opened with a loud and prolonged creak. The heavy footsteps entered the small space, making the floor vibrate under Jack's feet. He could feel an immense presence standing by the bed, watching him intently. The smell that accompanied the figure was of old sweat, tanned leather, and something metallic that could be dried blood. A deep, harsh voice broke the silence. The words were few, but charged with a casual cruelty that made Jack's skin crawl. The figure was talking to the two sisters, who had appeared at the door of the room, giving instructions about preparations that Jack preferred not to imagine in detail. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, the heavy footsteps moved away from the room, followed by the two women. Jack heard the door close and waited a few precious seconds before resuming his work with the ropes. Now he knew he had little time before they returned to carry out their sinister plans. The rope on his right wrist finally gave way enough for him to be able to slide his hand out. The skin was raw and bleeding, but he ignored the pain. With one hand free, working on the other ties would be much easier. Jack sat up on the bed slowly, avoiding making any noise that might alert his captors. His muscles protested the movement after hours in the same position, but he forced his body to obey. Freeing his feet was a matter of minutes once he had both hands available. Now came the hardest part. He needed to retrieve his weapons, get out of the house undetected, and get to his horse before they discovered his escape. In the darkness of the desert night, with 3 opponents of extraordinary size and strength, his chances were slim. But small chances were better than no chances at all. Jack got up from the bed carefully, testing his legs that were still weak from the effects of the drug. He walked to the table where his belongings were exposed and quietly retrieved his Colt, checking to see if it was still loaded. The familiar weight of the gun in his hand brought a little comfort amid the terror of the situation. He approached the window and looked out. His horse was where he had left it, still saddled, as if his captors had planned to use him for some specific purpose. The distance to the animal seemed enormous in the darkness, but it was his only hope of escaping from that cursed place. Jack took a deep breath, preparing for what could be his last attempt at survival. Outside, the desert night awaited, full of familiar dangers that seemed preferable to the unknown horrors that inhabited this isolated farm. Jack opened the window slowly, each movement calculated not to produce the slightest noise. The cold desert night air entered the room as a blessing, clearing the smell of mold and death that pervaded the place. He passed one leg over the sill, then the other, and let himself fall on the dirt floor outside. His feet touched the ground with a dull noise that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. Jack froze, expecting to hear screams of alarm or footsteps running toward him. But only silence answered, broken only by the dry wind that whistled between the loose planks of the house. The horse was about 20 yards away, an eternity when you're running away. Jack began to move towards the animal, keeping crouched and taking advantage of every shadow, every obstacle that could hide him from the view of anyone who looked through the windows of the house. He was halfway there when he heard the front door slam open with a loud creak. The yellowish light of a lamp poured over the balcony, followed by the imposing silhouette of the older woman. She looked around suspiciously, as if she had heard something that shouldn't be there. Jack threw himself behind a small pile of firewood, pressing his body against the rough wood. The woman went down the steps of the balcony and walked towards the place where he had been hiding just seconds before. His footsteps were heavy, but surprisingly quiet for someone of his size. For long minutes she remained still, examining the shadows, with eyes trained to detect movement. Jack held his breath, feeling his heart pound so hard he was sure she could hear him. The lamp in his hand created a circle of light that danced dangerously close to his hiding place. Finally she turned and went back inside the house. Jack waited until he heard the door close before resuming his movement towards the horse. Every step now seemed like an eternity, every shadow a possible trap. When his hands touched the horse's reins, Jack felt a wave of relief so intense that it almost made him faint. The animal recognized him and remained calm, as if he understood the need for silence. Jack mounted slowly, avoiding any sudden movement that could make the horse neigh. It was then that he saw the figure in the second-floor window. It was immense, completely filling the frame, and I was looking directly in the direction where he was. For a moment that lasted an eternity, man and monster stared through the darkness. Jack didn't wait to see what would happen next. He spurred his horse and darted toward the desert, leaving behind the cursed farm and its sinister inhabitants. The biting wind of night whipped his face as they rode on, but he had never felt anything so liberating. Behind him, she could hear screams of anger and frustration echoing through the night. One light went on in the house, then another, until the whole building shone like a bonfire in the darkness. But Jack didn't look back. He continued riding until the light completely disappeared over the horizon. It was only when the sun rose, painting the desert golden, that he finally stopped to rest. He looked back one last time, but there was nothing but dry land and distant mountains. The farm might have been just a nightmare, if it weren't for the rope marks on his wrists and the vivid memory of those eyes watching him in the darkness. Jack Miller continued his journey, but never again accepted hospitality from strangers. And on cold desert nights, when the wind howled between the rocks, he could still hear that voice echoing in his memory. "You're going to sleep in our room tonight." Some invitations, he had learned, were best refused. If this story of courage and survival has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives full of tension, mystery, and the fight for survival.